All right, everybody, we have about 10 minutes here. Usually I say 10-ish, actually, but there's guns on the table between us and Reuben, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the things that make them go boom, which is the old trigger. This
is my
safety.
Oh, yeah. I thought we were trying to settle something. No?
No, not quite. We do, in this case, we would each have one. So maybe we can do a which would you choose later. But at the moment, the topic is going to be single stage versus dual stage triggers.
Or two-stage.
Two-stage. I say dual stage. Why do I say dual stage?
It could be either
rocket
or.
boosters or something?
I think you're,
single
clutch.
Dual
Single,
stage clutch.
One or two. It's like going to the eye doctor. So, Reuben, talk to us about it, in the context of ARs here, like we have on the table. There is, we got 5.56, we got 6.5 Creed, we got all that stuff going on here. 6 arc, very cool.
Jeez.
Grocery getter.
The grocery getter. Now, why are there two different styles of trigger? And, obviously, a lot of people are going to ask, which one's best for which situation?
One's better?
Yeah.
Overall.
Which one's just better? Yeah, that's right. Which one's better?
I'd love the mechanical differences.
So, yeah.
How are they operating?
Enlighten us.
Well, you've got single stage triggers, which, if we go way back, was primarily the trigger is a single stage trigger. And when we're looking at an AR specifically, we're using it functions off of a different premise than a bolt gun trigger. So a bolt gun having a sear that when you press the trigger, it drops away from the apparatus and the firing pin is allowed to go forward. So it's a very simple design. The trigger mechanics in a bolt gun trigger are probably just as complicated, but the end result is that when you pull the trigger or press the trigger, however you say it, on a bolt gun, it's allowing something, you're allowing that hammer or that firing pin to go forward and hit the primer. In an AR, there's a lot more going on in terms of the time that it takes. They have a longer lock time, 3 to 4 times longer than a bolt gun. And so when we look at AR triggers, just like a mil-spec trigger, it's typically going to be like over 5-pound pull. So they're not, they don't have the reputation for being as good of a trigger. So we kind of go to a 2-stage trigger, which instead of having like a ton of creep and grit and stuff like that, a 2-stage trigger is going to, on purpose, it's going to have by design 2 separate, I guess you could have the same pull weight, but about halfway or 3/4 of the way through the press, there's going to be a wall where you feel as you press the trigger, it's going to feel like it comes to a stop. One of the big downsides of that is just typically they're not as fast. If you're talking like a match style, precision style 2-stage trigger, there are AR triggers like an AR Gold. They kind of have more, I would say, pre-travel and a really light break than as opposed to like 2 separate stages. Whereas like this trigger in this gun here it's a CMC 2-stage, and it's what's called a 2-2. So it has a 2-pound pre-travel and you hit a wall and then a 2-pound break. So it's kind of hard to understand how could it have the same pull weight if it's
is there even a wall?
Well,
if you're already pushing 2 pounds.
Because there's 2 stages, Jim.
Well, okay.
So you're getting to this point where it's actually like pre-travel that's intentional. So we're getting to the point. The real reason is so that we can know where that trigger is at all times. So we're not being surprised by the trigger press. So if you can see, this is clear. And what I'll do here is double check that. We're good. But you see this pre-travel here?
Yeah.
That's not like slop. That's intentional pre-travel.
Right.
And then once we hit that point right there, we've hit a wall, and then it'll break. But you can see on a 2-stage trigger, that break is really short.
Yeah.
Right.
So what's nice about a 2-stage trigger is really that if we were, if you want to prep the trigger to have more precision or to get a more precise trigger press, you can actually take up that slack or that pre-travel and hit that wall, and then you have a very small amount of movement to break the trigger, which sometimes it depends on the scenario, but sometimes that movement is what can cause you to press the gun left or right, if you don't have the kind of an optimal placement where you're of your finger on the trigger. So having that pre-travel allows you to press through the trigger a little bit while you're watching your sights and making sure the gun's not moving. You're not imparting a bias on the gun. And then when we hit that wall, we just have a very short amount of travel before it'll break.
If you decided, let's say you got halfway through that press, you hit the wall, and you're like, nope, I don't want to take the shot. You can just do that, right? I mean, nothing is set or anything, or nothing's changed.
It's not a set trigger.
Yeah.
So you're not actually like, you're not doing anything that's not undoable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're not full commit at that point.
Yep.
I've always loved, personally, a two-stage trigger. And I know we've talked about this before. I think on another podcast I mentioned we were talking about blade triggers on bolt guns and stuff like that, and how it's not really a two-stage, but it kind of feels like one sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like just having shot my old, we can't go 2 podcasts without mentioning
No.
the Ruger American. So many times now, that's like a 3-stage trigger to me, because there's the blade initially, and you're like, okay, I'm on the trigger, and then there's all the creep because it's a budget gun, and you're like, there's the, to me, 2nd stage, and then it's like, now I know it's going to go off, and you're always aware of when it's going to go off, and then I get behind these fancy single-stage triggers, which are super light, and everybody always, reveres them in precision guns, and I just can't quite ever get a sense for it. It's like I'm plumbed. Okay, it's off.
It can be really tricky to get that. A lot of guys in the precision world are going ounces, not pounds.
Yep.
I'm still at the end of the day, I still shoot more ARs than I do bolt guns, and so for me, I'm looking at trigger weights over a pound, really. I mean, like 1.5 pounds is really light. I'm really comfortable at like a 2 pound, 2.5 pound trigger. It's probably also what I have the most reps on, so maybe it's just kind of that what I'm comfortable with.
I was gonna say, like, it's ingrained into your shooting process, like having what would maybe be like, oh, this is a better, I'm doing air quotes again if you're not watching on YouTube, this is a better precision trigger because it's so light. That might throw you completely off.
Yeah, for me, the gun, I don't have the exact knowledge of when that gun is going off, but what you can do is you could go into a 2-stage trigger that has a little more pre-travel, so that it's not just the moment you touch that trigger, you actually have to bring it back to the wall. I'm trying to think of a car reference, but I can't, Jim, so
it's
I'll
okay,
leave that up to you.
But
yeah, so you'll have that pre-travel will allow you to know where in space and time your trigger is at before it breaks, rather than just, okay, I'm trying to find the trigger because you have to find the trigger too, right? You get your hand on the gun, and if you're finding the trigger is more that than actually takes to break the trigger, the shot's going off when you don't want it to. So
I don't know if this is at all a good analogy. It's not automotive, but with you, like, I almost see the difference in my head between shooting a single stage versus a 2-stage trigger. It's like shooting a single stage for me is like trying to write with a pencil without having the pad of your hand touching the paper. And shooting a 2-stage is like getting to write with your whole hand on the table.
That's a phenomenal analogy.
Because like if you're trying to write up here, there's not like you don't really have
feedback.
You don't have the feedback. It's like, okay, the pencil's on the paper, I'm writing. But if you have your hand down there, you're like, okay, now I can feel it out. I can get an idea. And then that's what it's like for the triggers for me. That 2-stage is just...
You've got a tactile point of reference.
Yeah.
For me, I actually shoot a lot more single-stage triggers than I do 2-stage. The 6 ARC over here is a 2.5 pound single stage, and the 6.5 in the middle is about a 2 pound single stage.
Yeah.
I guess for me, the typically with a single stage trigger, you're going to get a shorter travel. There's in modern AR triggers, like a good trigger, whether it be a CMC or a Timney or a Trigger Tech, like you're getting a trigger that doesn't have creep, it doesn't have any grit, and the pre-travel is very minimal, if at all. And so kind of what you'll find with modern single stage triggers is when you make that commitment, you're already at the wall to start, but you make the commitment, you're not pressing through the trigger. It's the moment that you decide to press the trigger is when the gun goes off.
Right.
Whereas compared to like an old GI trigger, like a mil-spec AR trigger, you're pulling through a considerable amount of stuff, and there's actually it's probably safe to say that you could make the decision to reverse your decision to press the trigger because there is so much pre-travel and grit. Good, I mean, whether it be a drop-in or something like a Hyperfire, good AR triggers aren't going to have that pre-travel and grit.
I'd be curious to know, I'll just bring this up, I think, early on, you'd hear like, oh, ARs, they're not that accurate. I wonder how much of that had to do with those triggers, like those really horrible triggers that were common in a lot of ARs.
I wouldn't doubt it.
I think that it's one of the easiest ways to get more potential out of your AR platform is to put a better trigger in it.
I know.
I don't know if it makes the gun more accurate, but I can tell you it allows you to shoot the gun more accurately.
For sure. Yeah, my original AR that I had before I sold it, went on a long hiatus, Jim, had the trigger that Reuben's talking about right now, and it was actually the only modification that I made to that gun. I put a new trigger in it, and it actually made it quite a bit better gun.
So I'm just going to demo this quick. The trigger press on this Santan rifle. This is a rifle I hunt with quite a bit. So it's set up with an Arca rail and a really solid handguard. But you can see how short the press is on this.
Bam.
And the trigger isn't going to move rearward at all unless it's going to break. So there's not, once that trigger moves at all, it's actually being assisted, more or less assisted forward or rearward. But then the reset also on a single stage trigger is, this one I've measured this one. This is like less than 1/8 of an inch, so it's very, very little. So the nice part about that is that both your pre-travel and your reset, or your press and your reset, are going to be the same distance on a single stage trigger like that.
Isn't it the case that now we've been talking a lot about like kind of almost like shooting? I think a lot of what we talked about is shooting precisely, sort of. But ARs are used oftentimes for like
speed.
Standing up, speed, CQB, fighting stuff. What's the preferred route for when you want to be up close and fast? You know what I mean? Like, are you trying to have that just sort of like fingers on the trigger and pulling, boom, it breaks, it's off? Or do you want to have, when you're up close and fast, that two-stage trigger where you can kind of prep it a little bit? I guess I can't.
In a competition setting, I actually really prefer a single stage because the targets I'm shooting at, once I've made that decision to press the trigger, I'm trying to get back on the trigger for the next shot because we're usually going to shoot a paper target twice. So not that splits are the only thing that matters, but like I'm wasting movement when I'm using a two-stage trigger, like a precision two-stage trigger. Now, again, like I mentioned, the AR Gold trigger, those actually have just a little bit of pre-travel. That's not even necessarily very much poundage to it. It's probably ounces. It's just a little bit of take up.
That one, that one almost seems kind of like a hybrid between the two.
There's all kinds of discussions on competitive forums if you want to go into the weeds on that one. People saying whether it is what it is or not. This trigger, the reason why I have the two-stage trigger in this gun, which again you might look at it,
14.5 or something like that.
14.5. It's not clone correct for the cloners, but it is definitely something that's set up more like what you would see, an M4A1 or something like that. But the reason why I put this trigger in, which is a 2.2, so it has a slight amount of take up, and then the wall, and then the break, and what you'll see is it has, there's another trigger, a Geisley, I believe it's a SSAE. That trigger also has a little bit of take up and then a break, and I think the thought process for that is that it's a short enough overall trigger press where if you want to be fast, you can be fast. And the reset's pretty short, but there is that, I guess I'm not going to speak out of my own realm, but if you were in like a duty application or home defense application, you need to make that precise shot, whether it be a hostage shot or a shot at on a high value target or something like that. You could then again, especially for shooting offhand, it's nice to have a little take up. So that's one thing where I will say, going from on offhand shooting, like if we're shooting a plate rack or we're shooting a know your limits target or something, or for a succession of targets, I actually like to have a little pre-travel because it allows me to get my trigger set, and then as soon as the sights come over the target, I can break instead of having to like ambush the trigger.
Okay.
Yeah. I tell you what, I still don't know what the answer is, which one's better. It's just that they both have pros and cons, and I feel like you have to shoot one of each in order to actually even... And then, of course, like you said, I mean, it's like you can't just take a two-stage trigger and have that be your representation for every two-stage trigger out there. So, I mean, you got to just try different triggers. I used to think to myself, everybody's always talking about triggers. Who cares? Like, just learn how to shoot a gun. And then started trying different triggers and was like, oh, wait, no, these are nicer. I don't like that one. And that one's too light. That one's too heavy.
My biggest thing for two-stage triggers, and I don't use a ton of two-stage triggers, but my biggest thing is just spatial awareness of where the trigger is and when it's going to break. There is this weird thing where anytime I get on the clock, if I haven't been able to like go to a practice bay and shoot the gun in the morning, there's always this thing where my first shot, I'm always kind of like, how much pressure is it going to take? And then once the gun starts going, you're like, oh, okay, that's where it is. That's how much it takes.
Yeah.
But sometimes like I've started a match on a stage where you start with an offhand rifle shot and the shot doesn't always go exactly where you want until you get the feel for it. Kind of like you said, you put your pad of your hand on the table so you can start writing more smoothly, more stable.
Well,
I don't know
try
if we
'em
solved
all.
anything, Jim.
Yeah, we may not have, but I mean that's kind of the thing. If you listen to this thinking you get the definitive answer, we've kind of proved that
We're glad to make things muddy for you.
we're always glad to make things more complicated.
I feel like there's like we talked about. There's some general rules of thumb, ish, but they really do both have their advantages. You know,
But
from a precision hunting perspective, I think I would like both, kind of for different reasons. Like the single stage is almost like most of my bolt action rifles that I've ever shot. Like just a little bit of travel. You know, that's the trigger breaks, off you go. But then knowing where you're at with the two stage is nice too.
Everybody has different preferences. I'm sure, like, I was even hearing, as Reuben was saying, like, the things he likes, I'm like, oh, yeah, I heard somebody else say kind of the opposite. But, I mean, that what you were saying in terms of just actually functionally how they work is it all holds true. You just got to try it. So, with that said, I don't know. Let us know in the comments on YouTube or on Instagram. What is your preferred route? In this case, we stuck with ARs because we know it can all vary as we go along to different types of firearms, especially if we were getting into pistols and all that stuff, different actions. But let us know what you prefer and why, and then let's get a discussion going, and we'll see if, I don't know, maybe you change our minds, maybe we change your minds.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
Get a good trigger and just shoot a lot with it. That'll help you make up your mind.
Ultimately, yeah. Anybody can learn to shoot well with just about anything, it seems, these days. All right. We'll catch you guys on the next one, though.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.